So this is Arnie. I'm sitting here with Phil Woods, who is a poet and I don't know what else, ex-teacher and sage and and a good guy overall. So and he was just getting ready to tell me about his grandfather.
Well, when I was 9, I helped my dad shovel chicken poop out of the chicken house. My grandfather Woods had several chicken houses. I think I put in 4 to 6 hours. Pretty hard work. He gave me a quarter. I mean, that was worth at least $1 back even in that era. But he was in the Depression era, you know. I was doing all right. I got to go. I never volunteered to do that again. And we didn't have masks or respirators or anything. Just breathing that dust. It was nasty.
Tell me about Pueblo, Phil.
Well, I think my people got to Pueblo pretty early. The Woodside used to had a 160-acre homestead east of Colorado Springs, and apparently there were wet years around World War I, and they did really well. And then there was a drought at some point in the 20s, and so they ended up in Pueblo, and my grandpa Woods went to work at the steel mill on the railroad inside the steel mill, and had this little, 2 or 3 chicken coops and sold eggs on the side, and grew a little corn, and but it turns out I didn't know. I never warmed up to him. Getting a quarter was one of the things. But it turns out apparently he was a big reader, and went to the library all the time, and all his kids were readers. And but my dad he went to Pueblo Junior College before World War II, and he was catching up on high school math and college math at the same time because he wanted to be an engineer. His uncle, Marv Greer, was part of the team that did the Big Thompson project, the tunnels, the water diversion, and my dad, I think, did some survey work for him before the war. Anyway, he was his big inspiration. And then my dad was in the Air Guard, so I think he already knew how to fly before World War II started. And at one point, I think he was supposed to go in B-24s to the South Pacific. He hated the B-24. They call it a flying boxcar. It would fall out of the sky at a moment's notice, where a B-17 could hang on, but my dad got bored. The planes weren't there, and so he volunteered. The field over, they were training pilots. He volunteered to help out. He was so good at training, they just kept him. But he felt frustrated that he didn't get in it. He would have loved to have gone to England and gotten some firefights with fighters, but I gather he was a good pilot. And I flew with him once in a small plane to Wichita, Kansas, and they let him fly a little bit, but he was an interesting man.
Yeah, tell me about your dad, man.
The thing I think about him is Colorado, with the mining legacy, you got that thing of the big score. You could make your fortune. And then he had this, from like his uncle, the honest civil servant. And he sort of never reconciled being happy enough to be just a civil servant with that feeling that he should be an entrepreneur and go make his and he quit the Bureau of Reclamation. He had spotted some farms. Just the way the land was, he was certain it had oil underneath it. And he negotiated some leases with these farmers and managed to get some kind of stake. And he put together a Safeway shopping center. And the Korean War started. And they froze building materials. And his partner panicked and tried to get concrete on the black market, and they got caught. And they had a penalty if it wasn't up and running at a certain point. They lost their money, and so that happened to him. So I think he always felt cheated that his big chance didn't happen. And so he went back to the Bureau of Reclamation, and we moved to Grand Island, Nebraska when I was in first grade, I think. And Eisenhower came in, the Eisenhower administration, and he favored the Army Corps of Engineers. So my dad loses his job. And he asked my mother where she wanted to go. And she wanted to go to Pueblo, which was not a good choice for him. And he tried to sell real estate, during the career. It just didn't work. And he ends up in the steel mill. And guys he went to high school with were now the foreman. I think the whole thing was just incredibly humiliating for him. But it's funny. I think in a funny way I might have impacted his work in a couple ways. We were renting this house on the north side in Pueblo, and it had this toy room attached to the garage. But I wasn't happy enough. It didn't have any windows. I wasn't happy enough just to play inside. I wanted to be on the roof. And so you could use the lip of the window and pull yourself up there. But I decided it would be easier to get up there if there was no lip. So I get a hammer and chisel and I'm taking off the lip. And the neighbor was a friend of the landlord's. He saw me and called the landlord, and we got evicted. And shortly after that, I believe he had his first crack up. And,
What do you mean crack up?
He lost it. I for some reason I was in the bedroom and he's throwing his diploma and all this stuff in the trash and just a complete meltdown. And he ended up in a private sanitarium in Pueblo. And I don't know whether he got electric shock at that time, because they did that all the time back in that era. And he came out of there and went back to work for the highway department on a survey crew. He had camaraderie, he had work he liked, he got really healthy, he had great tan from being it, but it wasn't enough money for the family. His sister said, well, you should try and get on at the Pueblo Army Depot. And so he started taking the tests, and so he got a job at the Pueblo Army Depot, but a perfect place to become a paranoid schizophrenic, And that's what eventually happened to me. But we moved a lot. I went to 5 different elementary schools. And so I think that's a hard thing, being the new kid a lot. And like, I had these 2 teachers for 5th grade. We were living east of Pueblo on what's called the Mesa, just a block from Pleasant View, which was a high school. My dad graduated from Pleasant View, but was an elementary when I went. And I really liked these teachers. And then either my mom or dad's GI Bill, we got this house in a suburb of Pueblo. But I didn't like the teachers at the new school nearly as well as, and then for junior high, I had to walk quite a ways to Risley Junior High, and we used to walk past the place. They called it the clay pits for the brick factory, and there was activity in the clay pits where kind of your first sex education. Well, what are those people doing down there? Well, the guy's butt's going up. And, but they had a tradition there where the 8th graders smeared the incoming 7th graders with lipstick, and pretty kind of a vicious hazing thing. And I'd had these two friends. We'd all been stamp collectors, and we'd had a falling out. They tried to haze me with lipstick, and I just beat the crap out of both of them. In fact, the one kid, some high school kids came along. It was a good thing. I was on top of him, and I was just pummeling this guy, and I'd raised myself up and put my knees right in his chest. And fortunately, they kind of pulled me off the kid. I might have killed him. I don't know. And his dad called my dad, to make sure this was not going to be an ongoing thing. But we just stayed clear of each other from then on. But I was not a violent kid. I mean, in that era, some of the Chicano kids would wear these real skinny belts, and they were pachucos, and people, and there may have been some gang stuff, but they had such a reputation for being fighters. And but I didn't, I was pretty big already as a kid, and but where was I going with that?
Well, tell me about school.
Well, I was only good at social studies. I could do all right in English to an extent, but I remember in that era, we diagrammed sentences like nobody's business. But I was never good at spelling, and I got caught with the cheat sheet between my legs one time. The teacher was walking around and reached right down between my crotch and grabbed the cheat sheet. Pretty shaming, And I liked science. It started falling behind in math. All my family and my dad wanted to be an engineer. Everybody's good at math, but not me. And then when we moved back into town, this junior high school had 9th grade football. So I played football, and then I wrestled, and I was already a heavyweight. I became the heavyweight champion in Pueblo when I was in 9th grade. And I beat this chubby Chicano kid. And I'll tell you, when they raised my arm, I was totally exhausted. But that kind of gave me this sense I'm a champion, and that's pretty good for self-esteem. But when I was a senior, I dislocated my elbow wrestling, and that was the end of wrestling for me. But,
what did your teachers think about you?
Somewhere in my senior year, people just suddenly decided I was college material, which was a good thing because they put me in a harder English class. I had to write my first term paper. I barely pulled a C in that class, but that helped get me ready for college. And then I had 3 schools scout me for football: Pueblo, Sterling, Northeastern, and Mesa. And the Mesa coach sold me on going over to Grand Junction. And that turned out to be a really good move. Some distance on my family and their problems. And but also my very last football game, we were playing Phoenix Junior College, and this guy was like 6'4", 280. He literally knocked me on my rear end. And it became very clear to me that I was not going to the NFL. And Greeley told me, come out and make the team. And so I drove down 3 days in a row thinking I would go in and get a uniform, and just walked away from it without any back and forth, or just sort of like, you took that as far as it's going to go.
Just let it go, huh?
Yeah, let it go. And never really regretted that. And then I had some good history people at Greeley, and a good guy for political science, although when I asked him a letter for my CO application, I think he was a cold warrior. He didn't respond. But my old history teacher at Mesa, in fact, he even called me up to write a supporting letter. But the funny story about that is, in my haste, the summer of 1968, my haste to get my application in, I'd asked for a letter of support from this guy, Dean Arnold, that taught Russian history. I inadvertently included his note to me attached to a copy of his supporting letter that I was supposed to keep in my files, but that's the one I gave the draft board. And so the note said, Phil, just back from Russia, hope this isn't too late. So there it was, Tommy Professor, dupe student. So the day I was supposed to graduate, I had student taught it at Sheridan High School. But anyway, I'm there with the draft board, and they just, you were raised Catholic, you know. Catholics have the just war crapola. And since I hadn't been raised Quaker, they said no. And then they changed the form, simplified it. I applied again, they said no again. And then in March of 1969, I went down for my physical. I don't think I could sleep that night. My blood pressure shot up, and they classified me 1Y, which meant they could have brought me back a year later, and had me go through it again. But by that time, you know, all the protests against Johnson, and I was safe, but I didn't quite realize it. Because my attitude was, since I graduated in the middle of the school year, that I couldn't apply for a teaching job until I knew what my draft status was going to be. Not realizing that if you wanted to make a statement, maybe be a popular teacher and go to jail you could have had a big impact on, you know, maybe. But I didn't think all that through.
Why didn't you want to go to war? I mean, why didn't you want to get drafted?
Well, my parents subscribed to Newsweek, and I think Walter Lippmann had a column in the Newsweek, and I think early on he expressed doubts about the wisdom of the whole Vietnam thing. And the folks I lived in this basement apartment in Grand Junction, an old couple. But I seem to remember watching the Fulbright hearings with them and just responding to the questions the doubters raised. Does this make any sense, what we're doing over there? And just becoming more and more convinced that it was wrong, but also in a way becoming more toward a pacifist. I think I read Thomas Merton on nonviolence, and Merton edited some Gandhi, and I had that, and I was hearing, you know, like I saw Joan Baez and David Harris speak at DU, and I was against the draft, and I was for draft resistance, and then the first time I ever heard of SDS, Students for Non-Democratic Society, and the New Left, I'm embarrassed to say, but it was a Nat Hintoff article in Playboy. But I read it and I said, SNCC, yes, I said, these are my people. I just right away identified. I don't know exact. My dad was a liberal, but why had already such a social justice sense of things? I guess my dad had me watch the military-industrial speech, and he thought our priorities were he's working for the Army, but he thought our priorities were way off, and we should be spending money building highways and hospitals and making life better here instead of all these adventures overseas. And but like 1968, it was such an intense year because your hopes would rise and fall, like McCarthy almost beats Johnson in New Hampshire. Then Bobby Kennedy gets in the race. But then King gets killed. But you have Columbia blow up. You got the French May. And then Bobby gets killed. By the fall, I think most of us felt like a sponge that had been wrung out, Just your hopes had risen and fallen so many times. And you got to all the events at the Chicago Convention, which people like Pat Buchanan loved because they knew law and order was going to work for the Republicans. We didn't know that, but they realized they could play the fear card and scare Middle America. And
tell me about your experience with civil rights.
Well, this guy had gone to see you for a while. His name was John Woolman, and he became an editor at the Daily Cardinal at the University of Wisconsin. And apparently there'd been this long-term connection between Madison, Wisconsin, and the civil rights people in Mississippi. And John called and said they're recruiting poll watchers to try and get a more honest election in Mississippi. We should go down there. So we got in my buddy Bud Starker's VW bus, ran into a blizzard, slept in the bus in eastern Colorado, and then drove to Missouri and hooked up with John and went down to Mississippi. And I got to see Fannie Lou Hamer give a speech in a church. An incredible speaker. And just the vibe down there was so repressive, no wonder people get lynched here, and I didn't see any funny business at the polls where I was, but friends of mine, where they were, the state patrol came and confiscated the ballots when the polls closed. And she got like 7 votes essentially in an almost all black community, And I remember I was sitting there was a motorhome, and this guy was a retired Chicago cop, and he was working for security for Mrs. Hamer. And I was talking with him, and I said, how do people keep going down here? It was so repressive. And then when we were coming back, this girl and I, we didn't want fast food, and so we went into a bar trying to get food. They didn't have any. But when we came back, this guy from Wisconsin, he was so pissed off at us. Said, you don't understand how dangerous it is. We didn't know where you were, and we didn't. We're kind of naive about things. But I felt like that was like a crash course in civil rights in America.
Yeah, you told me a story about the night when, after the election, and you were listening to some music.
Oh yeah, she only had 3 records, 2 Harry Belafonte Calypso albums that he had given her, and Marvin Gaye's "What's Going On." Well, we couldn't hang with Calypso at that point, so we kept playing Marvin Gaye over and over again, and that was the right mood, you know. But I mean, you know, it's been said that the secret of the blues is the power to endure, and that's what people down there have had to do, you know. But I mean, you know, it's like if you read Eric Foner's book about Reconstruction, they wanted black women back in those fields so bad, and they were going to make sure the freed slaves essentially didn't have any rights, so they were back in those fields, you know, essentially doing what they had done before. I mean, it's just rank exploitation, and yeah, it just.
So,
you know, there's a reason. What is it? Oh, what's her name? The singer had that song, Mississippi Goddamn.
Oh,
Yes.
Yeah, I can't think of her name right now. It's a great song and great woman. Dang, if I can think of her name.
Yeah. But I'd gotten turned on the light down Hopkins. I didn't realize where we were. Was right near Clarksdale, and there's a particular plantation, Muddy Waters. All these people, great blues people, came off that plantation.
Yeah.
You know, and what my last year in Greeley, I had a friend who turned me on to Light and Hopkins and other blues people, and some good books too. I feel like I'm a bluesman, even though I'm a white guy. I mean, I just really respond to that. You know, like I have a Lightning Hopkins where he does Trouble in Mind. I feel like I should go down and lay my head on that lonesome railroad line and let the big 1900 pacify this mind of mine. But then you get the counterpunctual thing, sun's going to shine on my back door someday. And no matter how sad the lyrics are, the rhythm is going right to the body. And the body's saying, yeah, you know, life is okay, you know. You can still have a good time here somewhere or another.
There's some lines in that about putting your head on the railroad track, but when that train comes, I'm going to pick my head on up.
Yeah. Might be the last minute, but yeah.
Yeah.
But also in a way, if it's just too bad, I got that option, you know, and in a way there's a freedom, even if it's just theoretical, a freedom in that I could just say fuck it, you know. And,
yeah,
I've had my battles with depression. I don't know. It could be in my family. It could be genetic. There's mental illness on both lines. But I think I've always come back, you know, from the darkest blues, and now that I've gotten older, it's sort of like I kind of feel like I got through the crisis. I don't know. I think unless I had some hopeless illness that said, I think I'll just stick it out myself.
So graduate school, did you go to graduate school?
How did that all happen? My buddy Steve Kester, his girlfriend moved to Eugene. And he met a friend of hers named Roger Moody, who was a poet and had gone through the program. I was trying to write. I'd quit the post office and spent 5.5 months going around Europe thinking I was going to write this novel. But I didn't know what the hell I was doing. And in point of fact, I didn't actually get that much writing done. And anyway, Steve said, you should maybe think about going to Oregon. So at spring break, I went and visited and talked to this part Cherokee poet named Ralph Salisbury, who had this wonderful glowing face and glowing smile. I just decided to do it. And I mean, from an economic point of view, it made no sense whatsoever to borrow money to get a degree in creative writing. Poetry? And that's what I did. Packed up, moved to Eugene, and it's tough. So, like one time, I had a poem about El Salvador, and it wasn't a good poem, and I just got chewed up in the workshop. Everybody took a shot at me about how bad my poem was. And I happened to be scheduled for a conference with Ralph the next day. And I get there, and he says, Phil, I want to talk to you about your poem. And I thought, oh, fuck, he's going to take a shot at me too. He just said, Phil, your poem helped me finish one of mine. He didn't tell me it was a bad poem, was a good poem. But he didn't kill my creativity either, you know. In Zen, they talk about a good teacher has skillful means, and that was skillful means, you know. And I've always been very grateful to him for that, because you know, he was really a good guy. But I got this postgraduate fellowship to teach at the prison one day a week, but the money was lousy, and I was tutoring Sundays, but the money was just too skinny, you know. And I thought those convicts would have more good stuff to write about. They had a lot of victim stuff going on in them, you know. Well, like one crazy guy, what are you in here? I stole the Roto-Rooter truck. What would possess you? But, I mean, a lot of people end up in prison, kind of in a way. They don't know how to cope with life, and they make really stupid decisions. Kind of like, I need somebody to just schedule me, you know.
Tell me about the first poem you ever wrote. You told me about.
Oh yeah, well that's such a funny. I was doing hot tar roofing, and we had done a job in Canyon City, and we stopped in Fountain. Fountain doesn't sound right.
Whatever.
This other town between Pueblo and Canyon City, and my foreman went in to talk to people, and I guess from the attic look at the roof. And I was sitting on the back stoop, and for some reason I picked up a brick and a bent rusty nail. I invented a woman named Susan and wrote this, scratched out this sappy love poem. And little did I know I was making a lifetime commitment. But what I like about that story is that it was so tactile. You know, I had to scratch it out. And the thing that had happened was my sophomore year, a World Lit class, we had this great anthology of Oriental Oriental literature. Had a lot of the great Chinese poets and Japanese poets, and the haiku, and those guys. Part of it was just the way they handled nature. it's a kind of alchemy that happened in a way. I mean, that stuff went into me and started percolating and generating this need for self-expression. Art has been called externalizing the self, and some of it was frankly was loneliness. I kind of felt like an outsider. I'd been the new kid in all these schools, and then an alienation and an estrangement from mainstream America. The whole status train and in a way materialism didn't do it for me. And when I got turned on to the Beats, Gary Snyder and Kerouac and Ginsberg, I felt this immediate kinship with those folks. I was in a used bookstore in Berkeley, and I bought an anthology of beat poetry, and this guy from Oregon, who was a friend of my friends down the street, loaned me Snyder's book Backcountry, and my feeling, because my grandparents had this cabin, I spent a lot of time in the forest, in the pine forest, and hiking, and I thought, this is poetry that speaks to my life. Like in the English classes, they wanted you to understand the rhyme scheme and all of that technical. I didn't give a fuck about that. And to cook a meal over an open fire and have the smells and sound, I could relate to that. And
why did you write poetry? What does it do for you?
It's almost like this mysterious energy happens. You can almost feel like you're too full with some kind of psychic energy, and you need some way. And the thing about poetry is you're not just blaring something, you're giving it a shape. You're giving it a form, and like endings of poems can be very challenging. I've been accused of going on too long, and I've had to learn, okay, chop this off. The poem ends over here and doesn't need the like sometimes I have a tendency to sum the poem up at this sort of coda, which isn't needed. And I've gotten better at either not even writing it or chopping it off. But and I heard I briefly lived in Santa Barbara, and I heard the poet Kenneth Rexroth, who did a lot of translating Chinese and Japanese poetry that I'd gotten turned on to. I heard one of his last poetry readings, and I feel so grateful that I got to do that. I mean, he basically sponsored the beat writers, and but anyway, in a way, he kind of gave me my aesthetic.
What inspires you, Phil, to write a poem?
I think it's a lot of times it can be just some kind of emotion, like obviously the blues, the painful stuff, but it's also the beauty of life, because a lot of the beauty of life is so transitory, and so the sense that if I could just capture a bit of that fleeting beauty.
Wow.
The other day I was sitting out back, and I was just really enjoying the last sunlight hitting the last orange leaves and feeling this sense of us. You know, I thought when we pass on, we're not like the leaves that add this layer of beauty as they're leaving, you know. I don't think old people, we don't think of ourselves as having a layer of beauty.
I remember you, of one of your poems you wrote about going to an orphanage.
My dad had an opportunity to get this schooling for his job, and my mother cracked up over Christmas. I shouldn't have been in on these discussions, but he asked me, we could get a housekeeper and you can stay here, or you can go to a Catholic orphanage. Well, I thought, I didn't realize it's always better to be in your home. But I thought I've been around this Catholic game my whole life. I said the orphanage, not realizing what it was going to feel like to go from a home to an institution. And they were 6 chapters ahead of us in social studies, so I felt really pretty lost. And the nuns all seemed to be crusty, you know, this kind of hard-edged. And one night I had to get up to pee, and in my family we just slept in our underwear. I don't think any of us had pajamas. And so I get up to pee. Who's getting up? How come you don't have pajamas? You know, I felt like I was getting interrogated. And my brothers ran away, and my dad brought them back, and we went into the chapel. This was like, I think we went in on Sunday, and this was like a Wednesday. And he's trying to sell me on sticking it out, because he figures if I'll stick it out, my siblings will. Well, Friday I took off. I walked home, I got my bicycle, but I didn't think of it as a protest to make him do something. I thought of it in terms of survival. When I tried to ride that and push that bicycle, I made it 16 miles. I think it's 32 miles from Pueblo to Beulah. And my plan was to break into my grandparents' cabin and just somehow survive up there. Not realizing, well, your dad's not just going to abandon you. He's going to do something. I didn't put that together. And I didn't put it together that, in all likelihood, the electricity was shut off, the water was shut off, and there was no food there. You know? But there's this big hill, and I had stopped just short of it to bump some water because I couldn't find the canteen. And then I was so excited, I thought, I'm going to get this long coast down this hill. So I coasted down the hill and pulled over because I wasn't ready to start riding again. And all of a sudden I knew this car's coming up. And I figured, oh, that's Dad in the station wagon. And he pulls ahead of me. And I thought, he's going to be taking his belt off. And I'm really going to get it. And just such a soft voice, he said, son, let's put your bike in back. We'll go up to Beulah and get a Pepsi and talk about it. And very compassionate on his part. And I asked him, I said, how did you know where I would go? And he said, I knew you would think of the cabin as a refuge. And so then we moved back home, and he didn't go to the school. Which, I mean, here I probably impacted his employment twice. First with the garage business and him getting canned at the steel mill, and now not going to the school. But you know, I'm 9 years old. What do I know? You know, I couldn't put all that together.
I remember you telling me a story about a college professor that brought up graduate school. What was your reaction?
How did that go?
You were saying that you'd never even considered it, never thought
Yeah, during this period when my dad was in the hospital, we were on quarters at Mesa. One quarter, I damn near pulled straight A's. It wasn't because I was so brilliant. I had some courses that worked for me, and I worked really hard because I didn't know what else to do. But I think it was that period that somebody decided this guy has talent. I didn't know, and I told him I wasn't a scholar. I just you can't go to 5 different elementary schools and come up. I mean, like I read this biography of Bobby Kennedy, and it talked about the kind of self-confidence Joe Kennedy instilled in his kids. I didn't have that. I think in some ways I might have thought of myself as something of a fuck up, but when my dad cracked up my sophomore year at Mesa, I offered to come home and go to work, and my mother said, "No, we want you to get your education." It was so good that because I was really thriving, in college, and some distance on the family and the family problems, and but Greeley was not the same. I never felt Greeley was as stimulating as the guy I had at Mesa, McKendrick. And, the history and political, it was okay, but I don't think I found it inspiring, except for Dean Arnold and the Russian history. And, it was.
So you became a teacher.
Yeah, I became a teacher, but it's funny to me when I got canned after Adams City High School, it didn't occur to me to go get a master's in history. It didn't, loans weren't that expensive. Got a PhD in history. It never crossed my mind. I was going to try and write a book about my teaching experience, which never got very far. And then I ran out of money, went to the employment office, and they sent me out to do concrete foundation work. Pretty stupid, $3.50 an hour I'm doing.
Wow.
And I was pretty lost and just sort of drifting along, but at some point, because there wasn't construction work in the wintertime, I went back to sub-teaching, and then I applied to Oregon and moved to Oregon, and that was a good move. And then I ran the lecture series for 2 years at the University of Oregon. And the first year, I brought in all these politicos. I had Ralph Nader and all that. And I think the thing I noticed, I guess, on the left and progressive, we're still so powerless here, We don't have a mass socialist party. It seemed like maybe rather than dispelling the alienation, might have been enhancing it, with these political. So the second year, I started bringing in more cultural poets, and I had Rollo May come in, and I had Gary Snyder and some other folks, and I did an interview with Snyder. That was much more satisfying to me. What year would it have been? That would have been in the 70s.
And you came back and taught again, right?
Yeah, I came back, and at some point, I ended up back in Pueblo, and I was just going around the state doing interviews, trying to get a teaching job. And kind of at the last minute, I got hired at Sheridan High School, and taught there for a couple years. And I fit there, working class kids, you know. But I'm sure I was probably too radical for that. My last year, I had Vietnam vets coming in, talking to the kids, and of course, I had the ROTC guy coming. To be fair, and he usually won the kids over, but I remember the afternoon class. These vets got attacked in the teacher's lounge over lunch. And the one guy, he was so pissed off, he had an artificial leg. I didn't see this. I guess I was teaching and I sent him to another class. Apparently he took his artificial leg off and tossed it to a kid. You think war is good? You want one of these?
Jeez.
Well, if I hadn't played to get canned before that, I'm sure that would have been more than enough. But, you know, I look back, I was pretty lost. But again, the times were so unsettled and so confusing in a way. I mean, you know, like when I was, am I teaching these kids or recruiting them for the movement, you know? Are we going to have a revolution or not? And I don't think, morally, I don't think that's so good. A teacher needs to be maybe a little more distance than that. And that's probably too subjective and potentially manipulative, and you know. But I just was caught up in the times, really, and but I mean, till I went off to get my master's, the 70s is just sort of did a lot of good backpacking, had quite a bit of fun, but in a way, no real direction, and you know, the energy of the 60s started petering out, and you know, you had people like Tom Hayden who said, okay, we got to go into electoral politics, but most people didn't do that, and it just sort of, then you kind of get the revival of the nuclear freeze movement and in the 80s with the craziness of Reagan. But
yeah, I remember the 70s. There was that commercial, the Pepsi generation, and I thought that fits us just perfectly. This is the Pepsi generation.
Yeah, they just sort of co-opted that generation stuff. Yeah.
So, any of your kids in particular, like, influence you, or you're telling me about a kid that you met that was actually teaching you?
Oh, I had this black kid. He turned. This was at Adams City. He turned me on to the Last Poets. He turned me on to Gil Scott-Heron. He was just so far ahead of me. He turned me on to Santana. He brought in Abraxas, said, "Mr. Woods, can we play this?" And all we had to play it on was the film strip record player. But Santana was so great, even on there it sounded great. You know. But, you know, and I just recently was thinking, those kids, some of them are probably old enough to be retiring. I'd really like to know how they're doing and how they did and whether I did them any good, you know. I was thinking about seeing if there's an alumni association of that group. You know, I had this thing, we call it the Freedom Frisbee Club. It was only about 7 kids. But I would drive out and take 2 or 3 of them with me. We went and saw a Brecht play. We would go to foreign movies down at the Flick on Larimer Square. And I know I had an impact on those kids.
Yeah.
One of those kids later worked at the Denver Children's Home. And we used to meet in his basement at his folks' house. I think if I remember right, his name was John Dillinger.
Wow.
I'm pretty sure it's Dillinger. I don't know positive it was John, but you know, those kids in Commerce City, a lot of them didn't be too savvy about how the buses worked. They were just cut off over there. They didn't all this cultural stuff, and they didn't know how to access it. Plus, a lot of them, their dads were long haul truck drivers, and so their fathers just weren't around. Like, you know, you football coaches can get a lot of interference from parents, or you can get support. But we just didn't meet the fathers because they weren't in town, you know. But I had the B squad, and my B squad was good. We were really good, and then I had the B squad wrestlers, and there was a B squad tournament, and we won, and so that was gratifying. I've sometimes wondered, like just recently, in the back of my mind, I always thought I would be a head football coach at some point. And I'm sure I could have done that, but I just sort of put that aside and forgot about it. And, you know, I mean, like, the whole thing with sports shifted for me and wasn't as important as it had once been. And other things took their place.
And tell me about the Romero Troop. How'd you get in that?
Well, I always feel like I've been to countless fruitless political meetings, little gatherings. You're going to do this, you're going to do that. We're going to most of which never go anywhere, and I'm part of that too. I didn't always do much, but right away the Romero Troop, that it had this thing. It was authentic, you know. It just and in part because it's not pretentious. You know, like Jim Walsh, he doesn't say he's the director. He doesn't say it's my troop. You know, it's this collective common purpose thing. And people see, there's an ethos to it. That people seem, almost everybody immediately grasps, this is not about ego. It's not really about self-expression. This is about the common good. Trying to discuss it, to arrive at it, to present it. You know, how do people help each other? You know, how do we lessen some of the suffering? And some of that is just to see people. You know, I mean, a lot of people are unseen. I think handicapped people feel unseen a lot, and it's like, if I get too close, I might get that, you know. And it's just, I immediately felt comfortable. I felt accepted and valued almost immediately. I think Jim knew something about my poetry. I forget exactly why, but I think he liked that I brought something to the party, and how did that work? I think he come and talk to a class? I don't remember.
But here you are, man.
Yeah.
How many years you been in the troop?
It's a long time now, and the other thing, the quality of the people that have come into the troop. We've had very little problem with ego trippers. People just, the friendliness, the camaraderie, it's just been one of the most gratifying things of my life. So I really, certainly the best political work I've ever, in a way, because it's almost incidentally political,
Yeah.
And, I mean, it's not propaganda. It's not agitation and propaganda. It's not that. There's nothing manipulative about it, that. I think in part because none of us are professional actors. We're just folks, just like you. And one of the most amazing things is to see people transform. These shy, self-effacing people become confident and it's so funny that time Jim and I were on stage waiting for this gal to come out and she froze. We're out there. How long is she gonna? That was funny, but all of that stuff builds these great bonds. I mean, the bonds of friendship and comradeship in that group. I think that, especially here in the second half of it's been one of the richest. I'm sure you feel the same way.
Yeah.
Richest experiences I've had. And like somebody like Angela who's teaching over in China now, but she has to be one of the funniest people I have ever met. And when she played the Grand Dragon and the KKK, God, it was just hilarious.
Yeah. Yeah.
Just hilarious.
So, tell me about your life at present. What's that like?
Well, it's funny. I've been feeling just lately that I should be doing more. The thought has even crossed my mind. Should I be tutoring one day a week? Should I just go down? No, I don't want to get scheduled like that. And then, should I be teaching poetry somewhere? And then it just, I guess, I don't like ever to feel ineffectual. And I guess I feel some need to be having some impact on things. I mean, like one of the things that I didn't like about being a mail carrier was here I know all of this history and I'm not sharing it. I'm delivering junk mail. I'm doing.
Yeah.
That didn't feel right.
Do you think your poetry influences people? Influences the world?
Well, one of the things, I'm from the kind of the Ginsberg best thought, first thought, but I say what I mean. I don't, my poetry's not buried in such elaborate metaphor and symbolic construction. People can get an immediate hit from it, and that has pros and cons to it. But since my goal is to communicate, I'm happy with that. I could understand with why somebody might move on from my poetry to something that might have greater depth. I don't claim to be the deepest poet that ever got in the game at all, but part of the beat thing was speech. The poetry is speech, and it should be the actual lingo that Americans use. It doesn't have to be. It's not British. It doesn't. It doesn't have to have all of this highfalutin stuff to it. And that you shouldn't have to have a PhD in literature to get it. That it's accessible. And I mean, that's one of the things that drew me to the Chinese and Japanese poetry is it's accessible. It has a lot of that has a whole deeper level of Taoism and but on there's an immediate hit of what the poem is about, and one of the things that you can see this even in like the samurai movies, the camera work with nature. It's been called a performance, but it is transitory. That beauty, it's going to shift. So take it in. Like I remember a time when I was doing construction, we were pouring concrete, and the cement truck was really late. We had all the forms ready to go, and I'm standing by the forms of this regular size house, and all of a sudden it's sunset, and I'm really in there. What are you doing? I'm enjoying the sunset. Oh yeah. Wow, man. Because each one's going to be slightly different, and why not take it in? Why not savor that little shot of beauty? And I guess that's part of what drew me into poetry. Was it celebrates, and it poetry can celebrate relationship. I don't consciously try and write archetypal poetry, but some of my poetry stumbled in that. And I have a poem, Fathers and Sons, that has a line that fathers and sons can never really get down to it. That's archetypal, and I just stumbled on it. But at a certain point, a son wants to father himself. He's no longer his father's ambitions for him, or you're deciding what direction you're going to go, and that can create a giant riff or some degree of riff, because if the father was going to think he was going to get something unfulfilled in him through his son, probably not. Son's going to go his own way, and that's okay. You should wish your son well. But pride and false pride can get in there, and it's there've been some movies where they've really gone into that. I remember a scene like a father touching a son. You've been such a disappointment to me.
I remember that scene you were part of where the son is talking to the father, and they're about to go into an internment camp.
I identified with that scene, even though I'm not Japanese American. I didn't have that experience, because it's interesting. Kind of. The Asian culture has that whole thing about saving face, and you don't bring shame on the family. That's like part of the ethos. So to refuse to go in the service in a way, that was a big thing, you know.
But it was real contradictory, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it was hard. So what, Phil, you've really been through some, if you don't mind my saying, some hard times here lately.
I've paid some dues. I sometimes I wonder, how the hell is it I'm still standing?
And you still get that big belly laugh, man.
Yeah, it's
what keeps you going, man?
You know, the tragic and the comic is so entwined in life. You know, it's just, it's not one or the other. It's you know, there's this great movie, I think it was a novel too, called Good Soldier Strike. But there's a scene, it's World War One, and a Russian and an Austrian, they're trying to just surrender to each other. You know, just, very comic. You know.
Tragic at the same time.
Tragic at the same time.
Yeah. What brings you joy at this point in your life, man?
Well, music, even though I'm starting to lose some hearing, music still really knocks me out. And like I just watched this thing about Muddy Waters. I was lucky enough, I think, to see him a couple times. And do you know, he made an album with these white boys, Paul Butterfield and Mike Bloomfield. I think it's great stuff. And there's a song, Long Distance Call, and he does this thing. And the little girl was saying, and the little girl was saying, and the little girl was saying, another mule kicking in your stall. Whoa, whoa, there's the blue. Yeah.
What else brings you joy? What keeps you going?
Well, and teaching and writing stuff brings me joy. And you know, I think one of the greatest things in life is friendship. I've never been too good at love in terms of bonding and having a long time love relationship. But I've been pretty good at friendship. I have friends for years and years, and you know, it's sort of like, it's hard for you to imagine when they weren't my friend, and then even if there's a gap, we just start over where we were. You know, there's no problem. We don't have to get reacquainted. And I think, in a way, it's unconditional love. You care for this person, you trust them, and you're good. You know, I think friendship's one of the most rewarding things in life. I don't think material things have that kind of quality of, I mean, you know, like in art history or art class in high school, I saw these photos of the Alhambra in Spain, the Moorish palace. And when I finally got there, it was almost like consummating a love affair. I'd had this desire to see this place, to go there. And then here's the humor. I got my camera, the batteries fall out. I go over the side of the... But fortunately, there was a little shop inside. I had to buy a new battery.
Well, let's leave it there, Phil. And just want to say you're my friend, man. And you talk about love, man. I love you.
The feeling's mutual, Arnie. And I felt that about you almost immediately. I don't know. You're such a salt of the earth kind of guy. And I just felt this immediate kinship. And you know, that's that's part of what's been so great about the Romero Troop. It's just, I think Jim Walsh is one of the world's greatest networkers, but also there's this moral core to Jim in a way, and he attracts people that have similar values, and
Yeah, I agree. All right, brother. Thank you.
Sure, this has been fun. And you wanted to be interviewed too.
He was on there.